What? You want me to go to a blind date on your behalf?
Okay, let me paint you a picture. It is a Friday evening. I am in my apartment, my small, perfectly organized, deeply beloved apartment that smells like shea butter and the remnants of whatever I cooked for dinner. I am sitting at my vanity, halfway through removing my makeup, which at this point looks like a crime scene because I work 12-hour days in a research lab. My hair, my full, gorgeous, long natural curls that I have spent the better part of my adult life learning to love, is piled on top of my head in the kind of bun that says I have stopped trying, and I am at peace with that. I have a half-eaten cup of ramen cooling on my desk. I have a drama paused at the exact moment the male lead is about to confess his feelings, which means I have been in a low-grade state of emotional suspense for approximately 40 minutes. My life, by every reasonable metric, is fine. Quiet, under control. And then my phone buzzes with a text from my best friend of 8 years, Yuna, that reads, "Angel, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to say yes before I tell you what it is." Now, here is what a reasonable person would do. A reasonable person, someone with firm boundaries and a sensible relationship to their own time and energy, would read that message and type back, "No, tell me first. Absolutely not. What the heck is wrong with you?" Well, turns out that I am not a reasonable person. Or rather, I am a reasonable person in every context except the one where Yuna is involved, because Yuna and I have been through too much together for my brain to generate the word no at normal speed when she asks me something. We shared a dorm room for 2 years during graduate school. I held her hair when she cried over her first heartbreak. She flew 12 hours to Atlanta when my grandmother was sick and sat in a hospital waiting room with me for 6 hours eating vending machine chips and not saying much, which was exactly what I needed. 8 years of friendship has essentially rerouted my decision-making circuitry when she's involved. I texted back, "Fine." 34 seconds later, I know because I watched my phone and counted down the seconds, she called. "Angel," her voice came through like she'd been saving it up. "Oh, thank goodness. Okay, listen. Okay, so my parents set me up on a blind date." I put down my makeup remover wipe, and I said yes before I could stop myself because my mother asked at Sunday lunch in front of my aunt and I panicked. And now there is a reservation at Haenwon tonight at 8 p.m. for a man named Shin who comes from a family my parents have apparently been in contact with, and she breathed. "I cannot go, Angel. I simply cannot." "Why can't you just cancel?" I asked curiously. "Because my mother already told his family I would be there. And if I cancel the date, it will be a whole mess and my mother will cry. And then my aunt will call and it'll be a 3-day family event about how I'm ungrateful and—" "Yuna," I cut her off because none of this rambling made any sense to me. "I know," she returned, sounding like she's hyperventilating at the other side of the line. "Why can't you just go? It's one dinner," I asked quietly. There was a pause. The specific kind of pause I have come to recognize as the pause before Yuna says the real thing she's been working toward. "Because of Junho," she said in a voice that sounded almost like a whisper. And that made me close my eyes, because I understood her situation perfectly. Junho was Yuna's coworker. They'd been working in the same department for 3 years. He was quiet, kind, chronically thoughtful, the type who remembered how everyone took their coffee and showed up with exactly that when things were stressful. Yuna had been in love with him for 2.5 of those 3 years and had told exactly no one except me. And every time someone mentioned a blind date or a setup, she got this expression like someone was asking her to betray a feeling she hadn't even named out loud yet. "Okay," I said. "Okay," she asked to be sure she heard me right. "Okay," I repeated. "Now tell me the plan." She made a sound that can only be described as pure, unfiltered relief. "I want you to go in my place. His family connected through my parents and they planned the date, so he doesn't know what I look like, he just knows the name. So you will go as me, and you can be a complete disaster just to scare him off. Be a little extra, you know what I mean." "How extra?" I asked flatly. "Maximum disaster. Like, order too much food, talk about weird things, be too intense, be too much. Make him call his family and say under no circumstances will this work. Make him run so fast that the whole arrangement dies and we never have to revisit it. And your parents. I'll tell them it just wasn't a match. He'll confirm. Nobody has to know the details. I slowly bite my lips, wondering how I'm going to pull this off at such short notice, coupled with how exhausted I was at the moment. Yuna, I called her name softly. I'll buy you ramen for 2 months, she said immediately. The good kind, the thick noodle kind with the egg. 3 months, I rolled my eyes. Done. Angel, I love you more than anyone I have ever known. Send me the reservation details, I said. His name, the time, the restaurant, and Yuna, I am going to be spectacular. She sent the details. I hung up, and I stood in front of my mirror, looked myself in the eye, and made a decision. If I was doing this, I was committing fully. No half measures. If I was going to be a disaster, then I was going to be a legendary disaster. The kind of blind date that will traumatize this man and make him describe it in therapy sessions for years. I will give him the kind of evening that would make him call his family and say please never, under any circumstances, involve me in any form of matchmaking ever again in my natural life. I smiled at the thought as I shook out my long natural curls, letting them fall past my shoulders in full, voluminous, glorious waves. I did my makeup, defined brown eyes that were already dough-shaped and wide, and the kind that people always noticed, fully sculpted cheekbones. I pulled out my most dramatic outfit, a deep scarlet wrap dress that my cousin had gifted me, and that I'd been too nervous to wear because it was, objectively, a lot. Floor length, fitted through the waist, with a dramatic slit. I stepped back and looked at myself. I looked extraordinary. My warm caramel skin glowed. My curls were behaving like they'd been individually encouraged. My body, the hourglass of it, the long legs, the broad shoulders and small waist, filled the dress like it had been made for me specifically. The problem, obviously, was that I looked the opposite of a disaster. I looked like someone's dream. But I reminded myself that was fine. The personality would do the work. The appearance was irrelevant. I was going to walk in there and be so magnificently, creatively unhinged that no face or dress would save the evening. My plan was thorough. I had mentally scripted no fewer than 6 sabotage strategies. 1, order excessively and make no apologies. 2, talk about my many, many cats with the fervor of someone who had replaced human connection with felines. 3, mention a very recent, very dramatic ex-boyfriend who I was definitely over. 4, float a business idea and ask this stranger to invest immediately. 5, suggest, at some point, that I believed we had met in a past life. 6, if all my plans failed, cry. And I will make sure I serve him the theatrical kind of tears that will create a scene and make him regret showing up for this date. I flagged a cab and rehearsed my crazy plan throughout the ride. I walked through Haenwon's doors at 8:10 p.m., which was late enough to be slightly inconsiderate, but not so late as to be alarming and uncultured. What I did not know, what I could not have possibly known, what no reasonable pre-evening planning session could have prepared me for, was that this blind date was going to detonate every single thing I thought I knew about the next 5 years of my life. Before we go any further, I need to pause right here and ask you something important. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, wherever you are watching from. I would love to know how far my story travels. Hit that like and subscribe button because we are just getting started and I promise you, this story gets messy from here. Now, let us proceed. Haenwon was the kind of restaurant that made you feel, the moment you walked in, like you had been subtly underdressed your entire life before this moment. Not because the people were ostentatious. In fact, the opposite. Everything was restrained, careful, beautiful in the particular way that money produces when it has been refined past the point of announcement. The lighting was warm and low. The tables were spaced with a generosity that suggested they understood privacy. The floral arrangements were the kind that looked effortless and cost a fortune. The maitre d' did the usual thing, a quick, imperceptible assessment, and then recalibrated when he took me in fully. Impressed with what he saw, He slowly straightened with a smile. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation?" "Shin party," I said smoothly, because Yuna had given me the name. "Of course, right this way." I followed him, running mentally through my opening strategy. I was going to sit down, be slightly breathless and scattered, mispronounce something on the menu, and then launch into an unprompted monologue about my cat collection before he could even introduce himself. Classic. Then Mater D stopped and I heard him say, "Your guest has arrived, sir." I looked up, and then my entire world made a pop sound in my head. I want to describe this moment properly so that you understand exactly what I was dealing with. The sound wasn't dramatic enough to make me go mad, but it was enough to evaporate all my pre-planned thoughts in an instant, completely wiped out. The man at the table was not what I had constructed in my head. I had imagined him to be corporate, bland, pleasant enough, the kind of attractive that exists in offices and doesn't require sunglasses. I had not imagined this perfection carved into human body. He was sitting perfectly still, which should have looked stiff, but instead looked like the stillness of someone who simply never needs to fidget or lose his cool, someone completely, and composedly at home in themselves. His face was what my cousin would call architecturally accomplished, jaw sharp enough to cause every female within close distance to have crazy palpitations, cheekbones high and defined, dark eyes set beneath equally dark brows that gave his expression a gravity that his age probably hadn't entirely earned yet but wore perfectly. His hair was dark and styled with the kind of precision that didn't look effortful, just inevitable. And he was built with the proportions of someone who took their physical presence seriously without being loud about it. Even though he was seated, across a table, in a charcoal suit that probably cost an amount that would make my brain shut down. He stood when I approached the table. Of course he did, because apparently on top of everything else, he had manners. "You must be Yuna," he said. His voice was low, measured, a voice that was used to being listened to. And that's when it happened. The recognition. "You must be Yuna," he said. His voice landed somewhere low, somewhere measured, the voice of someone who chose their words rather than emitting them. And in that exact moment, the rest of the catastrophe began, because I recognized that voice. I want you to understand the timeline of my realization, because it is important. First, the voice. Then, the face. Then, the memory arriving like a file finally loading after a long buffer, the executive floor elevator, 3 months prior, me having taken the wrong lift, him stepping in and saying wrong floor with a calm that suggested he was used to being the most composed person in any given room. And then, the mental image of the framed photograph in the company lobby, next to the mission statement, next to the security desk, the photograph I had walked past 200 times in 2 years and 7 months. Christian Shin, CEO of Shin Corporation. My employer. He stood when I approached the table. Of course he did, because apparently on top of everything else, he had manners. "You must be Yuna," he said. His voice was low, measured, a voice that was used to being listened to. And that's when it happened. The recognition. It hit me like cold water straight to the face. I knew that voice. I had heard that voice in company-wide video addresses. I had heard it in the elevator exactly once, 3 months ago, when I'd accidentally gotten on the executive floor and he'd stepped in beside me and said, "Wrong floor," and I had practically evaporated from embarrassment. Christian Shin. My Christian Shin. Not mine, absolutely not mine. I do not own him. But the Christian Shin, CEO of Shin Corporation, the company where I worked, the man at the top of the organizational chart, the person whose signature appeared on the company-wide memos that I read on my lunch break, the billionaire, the one, the only. My boss. I stood there for what I can only describe as one full geological era. "Are you all right?" he asked, still with that perfectly composed expression. My brain sent exactly one coherent instruction to my mouth. Say something, anything. Do not say you're my boss. Do not panic. You are Yuna right now. You are Yuna. You have never met this man. You do not work for this man. You are absolutely, completely fine. Yes, I said, slightly too loud. The couple at the next table glanced over. Yes, I'm totally yes. Hi, I'm Yuna, that's me, Yuna Harai. I pointed at myself. I'm the one. He blinked once, and then pulled out the chair across from him. We sat. I took a breath. You are fine, I told myself with great firmness. He does not know who you are. You have never been to his office. You only exist in his professional world as a name on a departmental headcount. You are Yuna. You are here to be a disaster. You can still do this. I hate to admit it, but seems like my entire sabotage plan, every beautifully engineered, catastrophic detail I'd come up with, has dissolved into absolute ash. Because the thing about my plan was that it had been designed to destroy a stranger's evening. Not the evening of a man who could, at any point, find out who I actually was and have me escorted from the building come Monday morning. I needed to regroup. I needed to think. I needed to get through this dinner without telling him my actual name, mentioning that I worked for him, or worst, dying of embarrassment. The waiter arrived with menus. I opened mine upside down, then quickly corrected it without any comment. Christian watched me with those dark eyes, and I had the distinct sensation of being studied. You're not what I expected, he said. Likewise, I said, and then immediately wanted to take it back because that implied I had expectations of him, and I, Yuna Harai, would not have had expectations of him because I had never heard of him in my life, theoretically. Have you been here before? He asked. No, I said, which was true. I don't usually eat at places where the menu is longer than my attention span. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but it looked like the suggestion of one. I looked back at my menu. Angel, I told myself, you are going to get through this dinner, excuse yourself politely, and never speak of it again. You are going to be perfectly normal and forgettable, and he is never going to know who you are. Then the waiter asked for our orders, and I, in the grip of some kind of stress-induced hysteria, ordered 3 appetizers, an entree, and 2 desserts because I had never seen a menu this luxurious, and my mouth had taken over from my brain entirely. Christian looked at my order, then at me. Hungry, he said. Stress eating, I said, and then, realizing what I'd said, I mean, I eat when I'm excited. I'm really excited. This is a happy amount of food for a happy occasion. He flashed me another almost smile. Gosh, this man was going to be the end of me. Here is the thing about Christian Shin that nobody tells you in the company newsletter. He is quiet, not in an uncomfortable way, in a way that somehow makes you want to fill the silence, in a way that draws words out of you like a splinter being removed, slow, inevitable, and oddly relieving once it's done. Within 20 minutes, I had told him that I grew up in Atlanta with 3 siblings and a grandmother who made the best sweet potato pie in the American South. That I had a degree in biochemistry and a master's in food science, and I loved my work. That my natural hair was something I'd made peace with in my 20s after spending my teens fighting it, and that it was, if I did say so myself, magnificent. That I had a fear of escalators that stemmed from a deeply traumatic mall incident in my 3rd grade. None of these things were Yuna's. They were mine, every single one. I had walked in here to play a character and ended up playing myself because he'd asked one simple question, "Tell me something about yourself." And something in my brain had said, sure, let's be honest, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that could happen was, evidently, quite a lot, but I didn't know that yet. He listened, actually listened, not the performative nodding that men do when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind. The kind where they're quiet and present and their eyes stay on your face. It was deeply inconvenient but felt like a warm hug. God help me. Your turn, I said, when I finally caught myself rambling about the escalator incident. What would you like to know? Why are you here? I asked, because it was what I genuinely wanted to know. You don't strike me as someone who needs a setup. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he was precise, the way people are when they've thought about something and arrived at the most efficient version of an answer. My grandfather set this up. He's concerned about the family line. It was easier to agree than to continue the argument. So you're here because it was easier. I tilted my head. That's almost romantic. I'm here because my grandfather has been threatening to move into my apartment if I don't comply with at least a minimum of his matchmaking attempts. I laughed. Actually, genuinely laughed, the kind that isn't performative, that you can't engineer. It came out of me before I could stop it, and when I looked up, I found him watching my face with an expression I couldn't entirely read. That, he said, is the first real thing you've done since you sat down. I stopped laughing. What? You've been performing, he said with the same calm, observational tone a scientist might use while describing a specimen. You were nervous when you arrived. You over-explained your name. You ordered too much food. But when you started talking about your actual life, you relaxed. And then you laughed. He picked up his wine glass. It suits you better, the real version of you. I stared at him. He took a sip of his wine. My heart did something architecturally unsound. You're very observant, I said carefully. It's professionally useful. What do you do? The pause was microscopic, barely there, but I caught it because I was watching him the way he'd been watching me very, very carefully. Corporate, he said simply. Corporate? Did he just casually mention corporate, like he was some mid-level manager instead of the head of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate? I wanted to laugh again, but this time it was the slightly unhinged laugh of someone who has found themselves in a situation so absurd that the only appropriate response is either laughter or a small, controlled collapse. I chose to pick up my wine glass and drink. Corporate, I repeated. Interesting. Yes, it is. Is it a big company? Reasonably sized, he returned. I think I'm going to need a second glass of wine. We were halfway through the main course when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, Yuna, checking in on the mission, and I made the stupid mistake of answering it, thinking I could whisper quickly and hang up. Is he terrible? Yuna hissed. Did you scare him off yet? Working on it, I murmured. Working on what? Angel, what have you been doing? It's been 40 minutes. Christian's fork paused, just barely. He heard that. I didn't know how. I didn't know what exactly he'd caught, but something had landed. I could feel it in the way his eyes returned to his plate with a millimeter too much deliberateness. I'll call you back, I whispered and hung up. When I looked up, Christian was cutting his food with perfect composure. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, I said, my cat. Your cat calls you. She's very advanced. He looked at me. I looked at him. Something passed between us, something that wasn't quite caught and wasn't quite known, but was hovering right at the edge of both. Of course, he said, nodding and probably wondering if I was crazy. By the time dessert arrived, and I want to be clear that it was beautiful, a chocolate soufflé that should have been in a museum, I had fully, catastrophically, given up on the sabotage mission. I had not mentioned my non-existent cat collection. I'd made it one cat and then panicked. Pretended to get a call from an ex. Demanded he invest in a fake business. Done anything at all to scare him off. Instead, I had what could only be described as one of the better conversations of my adult life. We had talked about food, real food, the science and culture of it, which was my actual passion, and he had listened and asked intelligent questions. We had talked about travel and about the particular loneliness of being professionally driven in a world that sometimes prefers you to be less so. We had talked about family expectations, and his grandfather and my grandmother, and somewhere in between the main course and the dessert, the performance had completely fallen away, and I had just been myself. Angel, not Yuna, but me. Which was the exact opposite of what I was supposed to be. I was in so much trouble. Yuna would definitely peel my skin. I have to be honest with you, I said, because the wine had loosened my better judgment and the soufflé was making me reckless. He looked up. Tonight wasn't what I expected, I said carefully. I came here thinking, I stopped. I couldn't finish that sentence. I just didn't expect to have a good time. Christian set down his spoon. He looked at me the way he'd been looking at me all evening, with that quiet, measuring attention that I was beginning to understand was not coldness but precision. He was the kind of person who looked at things until he understood them. "Likewise," he said, and this time it didn't hang awkward between us. It settled, warm and a little heavy, like a hand on a shoulder. The waiter came. The bill was settled before I could reach for my bag, and when I made the obligatory protest, Christian gave me a look that was so unimpressed it was almost funny. "I invited you," he said. "Technically, your grandfather invited me. Then I'm accepting responsibility on his behalf." We stood from the table. The restaurant had thinned out around us. It was later than I'd realized. We walked toward the exit and stepped out into the cool night air together. On the sidewalk, he turned to look at me. "I'd like to see you again," he said. My heart did the unsound architectural thing again, worse this time. "You would," I said, but it came out weak like a half-baked question. "I don't say things I don't mean," he returned. "That's either very admirable or very terrifying." Possibly both. I looked at him standing there in the night, streetlights doing absolutely unfair things to his features, and thought about all the ways this was already a disaster. He thought my name was Yuna. He didn't know I worked for him, and the woman he'd spent the evening with wasn't the woman he'd been set up with, and the woman he'd been set up with was desperately in love with someone else. "Christian," I said, and then caught myself, because I wasn't supposed to know his name. He hadn't told me his first name. His grandfather's setup had been under a formal introduction. Shin had introduced himself by surname at the table. The tiniest pause. "You know my name," he said. "You mentioned it," I said. "Earlier." He hadn't. We both knew he hadn't. He watched me for a long moment, and then, quietly, "What is your actual name?" The world went very still. "I told you," I said. "Yuna." "The person on the phone called you Angel." "Oh no, now I'm cooked, this was so bad." "That's my nickname," I stammered. "Your nickname is Angel. My grandmother started it." "And your real name?" I looked at him, he looked at me. The night air moved between us. "I think," I said carefully, "that we should not complicate a very nice evening." He was quiet for a moment. Then, to my absolute bewilderment, "I'll take that as a confirmation." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, not a regular business card, but the kind that was thick as cardstock, cream-white, minimalist, with just a number and his name in embossed letters, and held it out to me. "When you're ready to stop performing, call me, whatever your name is." I took the card. He inclined his head once, the way people do when they've concluded a meeting, and turned to walk toward a waiting black car that had appeared at the curb like it had always been there. I stood on the sidewalk in my scarlet dress with a business card in my hand, and what could only be described as a deeply personal crisis unfolding in my chest. I looked at the card. Christian Shin, CEO, Shin Corporation. I spent the entire weekend trying to decide whether to pretend the dinner had never happened, call Yuna and confess the catastrophe I somehow got myself into, tender my resignation from Shin Corporation, or move to another country. Instead, I chose the second option, then immediately regretted it when Yuna picked my call and spoke to me for 45 minutes straight, alternating between dying laughter and genuine concern. You liked him," she kept saying. I did not say that. "You said the evening was nice." It was a neutral descriptor. "Angel, you don't use the word nice about anything. You once described a sunset as demonstrably above average." The sky was brilliant that day. "Did you give him your number?" "He gave me his." There was a sound from Yuna's side of the phone that was somewhere between a shriek and a wheeze. "And, did you text him? Did you call him?" "Yuna, he thinks I'm you." The sound stopped. "Oh," she said. "Yes." "Oh no." Also, he figured out my name is not actually Yuna. "For real?" "I know, right." "What did he say?" "He told me to call him when I was ready to stop performing." There was a long, loaded silence. "That is," Yuna said eventually. Genuinely the most romantic thing I've ever heard. He is my CEO, Yuna. Oh, that is genuinely the most stressful thing I've ever heard. I didn't call him. I didn't text him. I tucked the card into the pocket of my work bag and I went asleep, and I woke up on Monday morning and got dressed for work in a lilac dress suit and told myself firmly that the weekend was over and I was a professional, and what had happened at Haenwon was a contained incident that would not affect my real life in any measurable way. I walked into Shin Corporation's main building at 8:47 a.m. And exactly around 8:52 a.m., the executive elevator opened and Christian Shin stepped out. We saw each other across the lobby at the exact same moment. The world paused, again, for the second time in 3 days. He was in a navy suit, impossibly well-fitted and perfectly tailored for him. He looked every inch like a man who was somehow even more polished in his professional environment than he'd been in a restaurant, which should have been impossible. He had a phone to his ear and a look of deep, executive-level concentration. But the moment his eyes landed on mine, the concentration shifted into something else. Something that I can only describe as recognition, followed immediately by a sharpening of attention that made me want to take 2 steps backward and also possibly run. He lowered the phone from his ear. The people around us continued moving, employees filing in, badges being scanned, ordinary Monday morning business being conducted. And the two of us stood there in the middle of it like 2 magnets that had found each other and were figuring out whether to attract or resist. "Angel," he said. It was not a question, nor a greeting, but my name in that low, certain voice, like he was confirming something he'd already solved. "Mr. Shin," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. "So you do work here," he said. "Yes, sir, in the food science research lab," I said, because apparently when I panic, I provide detailed specifics. "Sub-level 3. I've been here 2 years and 7 months and I have never entered your office. This is. Technically, my company employs over 3,000 people," he said, cutting me off. "I can't be expected to know them all." "Right," I exhaled. "Right, so this is we can just have dinner with me this Friday," he said. I blinked. What? I looked around. Several people had noticed us and were now performing the very specific act of pretending not to notice us. "You want to. Friday evening, 7 o'clock, I'll send a car." "You don't know my address." "You work for my company. I have HR resources." That is a deeply alarming misuse of HR resources. Is that a no? I looked at him. I looked at his face, which remained infuriatingly, beautifully composed, with a glint of amusement in his eyes. I thought about the dinner and our conversation and him saying, "Call me when you're ready to stop performing." I thought about how spectacularly, completely backwards this entire situation was. I thought about how I had walked into a restaurant to be a disaster and had accidentally been the most authentic version of myself I'd been in years. "Sorry, I need to think about it," I said. He nodded once. "Friday," he said, and moved past me toward whatever his morning held, and I stood there in the lobby of Shin Corporation feeling like someone had tipped the floor at a 5-degree angle, and I hadn't quite found my footing yet. The complication arrived, as complications tend to, in the form of someone else's feelings. Her name was Seo-yeon, and she was the head of strategic partnerships, and she had been, according to Yuna's extensive corporate gossip network, interested in Christian Shin for the better part of 2 years. She was beautiful in a sharp, decisive way, perfect makeup, perfectly tailored everything, the kind of woman who seemed to be conducting invisible interviews of everyone at all times. I first noticed her watching me on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the lobby encounter with Christian. By that point, Christian and I had had 3 dinners. They had each been different from the one before. The first was formal, cautious, circling. The second was warmer, longer, with more laughter than I'd anticipated from a man who communicated primarily through controlled expressions and well-chosen words. The third had involved a walk along the waterfront after the restaurant because neither of us had been ready to end the evening, and he'd listened to me talk about my research, the actual science of flavor development, the way certain compounds interact with memory, the reason food can make you feel like you're somewhere else entirely, with the focused interest of someone who was genuinely engaged and not just waiting for a pause. He was, as I was discovering, relentlessly easy to talk to, which was deeply inconvenient given that I was also, technically, beginning to develop feelings for him. Feelings that I was documenting the same way I documented research findings, with observation notes, controlled acknowledgement, and a firm refusal to draw premature conclusions. Seo-yeon found me in the break room on a Wednesday morning. She poured herself a coffee and smiled. "You're Angel from research, aren't you?" "That's me." "I've heard your name around lately." She let that sit. "Interesting." I looked at her over my mug. "Is it?" I said pleasantly. "Christian tends to keep his personal life very separate from the office," she said. "It's unusual for that line to blur." "I think you might be working with some incomplete information," I said, keeping my tone light and my expression open. She sipped her coffee. "He's been set up before, you know. His grandfather's very persistent. The women usually get a dinner, maybe two, and then nothing. Christian isn't, he doesn't let people in easily." She was trying to tell me something. I mentally received it, noted it, and filed it. "Good to know," I said. "I'm just saying," she smiled again. "Don't read too much into attention from someone like him. It can be misleading." She left. I finished my coffee, and then I stood in the break room for a moment and asked myself, very directly, "Are you letting this get away from you?" The answer, which arrived with uncomfortable clarity, was positive. That evening I called Yuna and told her about Seo-yeon, and Yuna said, "She sounds threatened," and I said, "Or she's right," and Yuna made a sound of such thorough dismissal that I had to laugh. "Angel, he sends you cars. He walked along the waterfront with you at 11 p.m. in a $3,000 suit. He called you by name in the lobby in front of half the company when he could have easily pretended not to know you. This is not a man who is misleading you." "He barely knows me," I said. "We've only had 3 dinners. It took Junho 3 weeks to learn my last name, and I'm still in love with him, so clearly I am not the model of efficiency here. But Angel, sometimes people just know when they meet their special person. You know. That is the least scientific thing you've ever said." "Love is not a science." "Everything is a science," I objected. "You are the most exhausting person I love," Yuna said, and hung up. Christian found out the whole truth on a Thursday evening, approximately 4 weeks after the blind date. We were at his apartment, which, if you have ever wondered what the apartment of an obscenely wealthy CEO looks like, I can tell you. It looks like someone took the concept of understated luxury and pushed it into the stratosphere. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Furniture that was expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. Art that I was almost certain belonged in galleries. We'd had dinner delivered, a deliberate choice because, as I had told him 2 dinners ago, restaurant settings were making me want to perform and I was trying to stop performing, which made me think of what he'd said on the sidewalk that first night. He'd smiled, actually smiled, the full version, which was a thing of devastating beauty, and said delivered food it is. We were sitting on his couch. He'd been asking me about my research again. I'd been telling him about a project on flavor memory, how certain food compounds can be calibrated to evoke specific emotional states, and at some point I'd gotten genuinely animated about it. Because I always do, and I'd grabbed his notepad off the coffee table and started sketching out a compound diagram. He looked at the diagram. He looked at me. "This is from the R&D brief for Q2, he said. I froze. The notepad was in my handwriting. The diagram was one I'd sketched during a team meeting. It was, in fact, from the internal brief. I hadn't been thinking. I'd been comfortable. I'd been entirely myself. "Angel, I have been meaning to ask you a question," he said. I immediately went silent, because my instinct told me he was going to finally ask the dreaded question. "Tell me exactly what happened in the blind date," he said. "I was only standing in for Yuna, my best friend. I paused and continued. I was supposed to scare you off. I came in planning to be terrible and then you were, I gestured at him, which was vague but felt accurate, and the plan completely fell apart. He was quiet. His expression had gone very still in a way I'd learned meant he was processing rather than reacting. I had come to understand that Christian Shin felt things deeply. He simply did not broadcast them in real time. "Why did you lie about your name?" he said. I panicked, and then when you figured out it wasn't right, I couldn't tell you. "So you choose to lie to your boss instead. I knew you work in my company," he said. "Sub-level 3, huh? Food science and development, yes. You've been in my employ for 2 years and 7 months. And 15 days, I stopped. Not that I've been counting, it just came up in my HR review. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stood there looking out at the city. I sat on his couch with the notepad in my hands and waited for whatever was coming. Because I was not, despite everything, naive. I had been carrying this complication since the first evening, and it had been reasonable to expect it would eventually arrive. "I think my grandfather is going to find this hilarious," he said finally. I blinked. He turned from the window. "You were going to scare me off," he said. There was something in his voice, not anger, not hurt, but something careful, something moving toward the edges of something larger. "I was," I said. "But you didn't." "I tried, the plan just fell apart," he said, helping me complete my words. He slowly walked back to the couch, but he didn't sit. He stood and looked down at me, and the expression on his face was one I hadn't seen from him before, open in a way he normally wasn't, something laid out in it that wasn't composed or controlled. "I've sat across from many people in my adult life," he said, "in meetings and dinners and events, and I have spent the majority of those interactions being aware of the distance between what they present and who they are. I'm very used to performance." He paused. "And then you sat across from me and spent approximately 15 minutes performing, and then abandoned it entirely, and talked to me about escalators and sweet potato pie and the emotional memory of food compounds." And he stopped. I waited, almost holding my breath. "I realized that I didn't want the evening to end," he said. "That has not happened to me in a very long time." My chest started doing the architecturally popping sound again. "Christian," I said. "The fact that you work for me is only a complication," he said, "but not an ending. It's a significant complication. I'm the CEO. I manage significant complications for a living. This one involves feelings," I said, "which are reportedly harder to manage than quarterly projections." "Reportedly," he sat down and looked at me. "Are you telling me to end this?" "I'm telling you it's complicated. Things worth having generally are." I looked at him. I looked at this man who had, over the course of 4 weeks, become someone whose voice I looked forward to hearing, and whose attention I had begun to need in a way that was both wonderful and alarming. Same man who asked good questions and listened to my answers. Who had apparently been doing his own version of the same slow, careful reckoning I'd been doing. "What exactly are you proposing?" I said. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Whatever that looks like, I want to call it what it is." "And what is it?" "I think you know what it is." I did. I absolutely did. But I was a scientist, and I preferred things stated with clarity. "Christian," I managed to whisper. "I'm asking you to be with me," he said, with the same directness he used for everything. Not as a blind date standing in for someone else. Not as an employee having dinner with her boss. As yourself, Angel. The person who talks too much about chemistry when she's nervous and who laughed at something I said and made me want to hear it again. I was quiet for a moment. "You're used to women throwing themselves at you," I said. "Yes. I'm not going to do that. I know you won't throw yourself at me. That's not what I want. I argue. I will tell you when you're wrong, and I will definitely be right sometimes, possibly often. I expect nothing less. And the company. I'll speak to the legal team about appropriate disclosures. We'll handle it properly." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked at me with that steady, patient certainty that was one of the most infuriating and compelling things about him. "Fine," I said. "Fine. He repeated to be sure he heard me. Yes, fine, I'm in. This is fine. He looked at me with that full smile again, the devastating one that does something to my heart. This strangely feels romantic, he said, grinning. I'm going to need time to get used to this, I said. Probably a week or more. Okay, wait. I know you're invested right now. I can feel it through the screen. Before we go into the final chapters, I need you to do one thing. If you've been here since the beginning, drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment so far. Was it the blind date or the lobby encounter? Because I'm living for your reactions. Hit that like and subscribe button because we are going to the good part. Now let's proceed. His grandfather was named Daeho Shin, and he was 81 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, and absolutely, completely unmanageable. I met him on a Saturday, 6 weeks into whatever relationship Christian and I were officially in, as I had termed it in my head, which was the most clinical way possible to describe being in a relationship with someone who made my heart do structurally heartwarming things that sends butterflies to the pit of my belly every time he walked into a room. The grandfather arrived at Christian's apartment unannounced, which I was later told was his signature move, and found the two of us in the kitchen, me explaining a flavor pairing concept while making the best jollof rice of my life, because I cooked when I was nervous, and I had been nervous since Christian mentioned the family visit was imminent. Daeho Shin walked into the kitchen, stopped, and looked at me with an expression of absolute, undisguised delight. Ooh, he said, just that, one sound. Grandfather, Christian said, with the precise tone of a man exercising great restraint. I presume you're Angel, Daeho said to me. The one from the blind date, the one he has been. He waved his hand in a complicated gesture that seemed to encompass the entire situation. He has heard about me. I looked at Christian. He's paraphrasing, Christian said. Well, Christian told me nothing, you understand, Daeho continued, apparently having decided I was the more interesting conversational partner. For weeks, all I know was that he suddenly stopped complaining about the matchmaking. Then I heard from, he named someone I didn't know, that there is a young woman. When I found out she works at the company, I nearly collapsed. His father would have, he stopped, looked at Christian, and modified whatever he'd been about to say, been surprised. Are you hungry? I asked, because food is universal diplomacy. I was only trained to play safe before things spiral beyond control. Daeho's eyes immediately lit up at my suggestion. He looked at the pot on the stove. What is that? Jollof rice. It's a West African dish. My grandmother's recipe. He was already pulling a stool to the kitchen counter. Show me. We spent the next 45 minutes cooking together while Christian leaned against the doorframe and watched with an expression that was, if I was reading it correctly, something between amused and quietly undone. Daeho asked me everything. Where I was from, what I studied, what my grandmother was like, why I'd chosen food science of all things. Did I believe in fate? Had I intended to fall in love with his grandson, or had it been an accident? It was an accident, I said honestly, without hesitation. Daeho cackled. The best ones always are. I glanced at Christian. He was watching me with that look. The one I'd started categorizing in my head as the look because it had no other classification. When the food was ready and we sat together at the table, Daeho ate with the concentration of a man taking something seriously. And when he finished, he put his chopsticks down, folded his hands, and looked at me. You will be good for him, he said. Grandfather, Christian started. You are the kind of person who is exactly herself, Daeho continued. Do you know how rare that is, especially for someone in his position where everyone is always performing something? He looked at Christian. She came to scare you off and stayed to be herself. That says something. How do you know she came to scare me off? Christian asked. Daeho smiled. I know everything. He picked up his spoon. Also, I spoke to her friend, Yuna, very charming girl, hopelessly in love with a coworker. Someone should probably do something about that. I choked on my rice. The corporate complication arrived in the form of a company-wide meeting announcement 3 weeks later. Christian had discussed with the legal team. There was a disclosure filed. It had been handled with exactly the professionalism he'd promised, and the only people who needed to know knew. The people who didn't need to know also knew, because this is how office gossip work. My immediate team was supportive in varying degrees. My lab partner, Jae-yoon, said, "I knew something was different. You've been smiling at your compounds," which I denied. My department head was professionally neutral. The HR coordinator who processed the disclosure gave me a look that I chose to interpret as warm rather than alarmed. Seo-yeon from Strategic Partnerships said nothing, which was somehow louder than if she'd said something. I walked through the office corridors the Monday after the disclosure with my head up and my stride even, because I had not done anything to be ashamed of. I had fallen into a situation backwards and stayed in it with both eyes open, and whatever anyone thought about that was their own business. Christian passed me in the hallway on Tuesday with 2 members of his executive team and said with perfect composure, "Good morning, Dr. Brown." And I replied, "Good morning, Mr. Shin," with equal composure. And then, because nobody else could see the direction of his gaze, he looked at me in the particular way he does when we're together, but it only lasted for approximately 5 seconds. I slowly walked to my lab and had to sit down for 10 minutes to recover. It happened on an evening 3 months after the blind date, which means it happened fast by conventional measures, and exactly on schedule by the measure of 2 people who had been paying very close attention to each other. We were at the waterfront, the same stretch we'd walked the second time we'd had dinner together, which had become, without either of us declaring it, our place. The city spread behind us, and the water moved ahead, and the light was doing the late evening thing where everything goes amber and generous. I had been telling him about a breakthrough in my research, an actual breakthrough, the kind that makes you want to call everyone you know, a flavor compound that could be used to help patients with memory disorders access emotional recall through food. The kind of work that had made me go into food science in the first place, that had made me drive past the straightforward industry jobs and go into research instead, with the longer hours and the uncertainty of it. He listened, the way he always did, and when I finished, flushed and gesturing and probably incoherent with excitement, he said, "That's extraordinary, Angel." Not a boring word like nice work. Instead, he said it like my discovery had already been registered as fact. I looked at him standing there in the amber light, this devastatingly handsome, infuriatingly private, quietly devoted man, and felt something so clear and complete move through me that for a moment I didn't have words for it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay." "When you came to that dinner," he said, "I had already decided it would be the last one I agreed to. I was there as a courtesy to my grandpa, and I planned to be done in an hour." He paused. "And then you arrived, and you said your name wrong 3 times, and you ordered an unreasonable amount of food, and you talked about escalators, and he looked at me, found myself not wanting to leave." "You've already told me this," I said softly. "I haven't told you this part." He reached into his jacket pocket. "My grandfather asked me last week what I was waiting for. I told him I was being thorough." I looked at what he'd taken from his pocket. It was a small box, dark, unassuming, the kind that meant one very specific thing. My heart stopped, then restarted, at a different pace. "Christian," I said, "you told me at the beginning that you argue, that you'll tell me when I'm wrong, that you'll be right often." He opened the box. Inside, a ring, clean, brilliant, and huge. "I want all of that. I want the arguments and the right answers and the flavor compounds and the jollof rice and the escalator stories." He looked at me. "I want to know you for the rest of my life." I was quiet for a moment. My eyes were doing things I wasn't fully in control of. "Are you," I mumbled, voice slightly unsteady, "asking me to marry you?" "Yes, I am. We've only known each other for 3 months. We've known each other since the moment you told me about your grandmother's sweet potato pie and forgot to perform," he said. "Some of that was 3 months. The rest of it felt immediate." I looked at him. This man who had refused to be scared off by my chaos, who had found me in a lobby and said my name like a fact, who had listened to me talk about science with the full weight of his attention, who had eaten my jollof rice with his grandfather and watched me with that look. "Yes," I said. Yes. Yes, Christian. Obviously, yes. He put the ring on my finger. And then, because this was Christian Shin and he did not do anything halfway, he pulled me toward him and kissed me in the amber light on the waterfront, and it felt extraordinary. Epilogue. The thing happened. The first thing, Yuna confessed to Junho 3 days after I told her about the engagement. She texted me from the coffee shop where it happened. He said he likes me too and have been planning to ask me out. I am deceased. Call me. I called her. She was not deceased, but she was crying, which for Yuna is essentially the same thing. The second thing, Daeho Shin officially declared himself my adopted Korean grandfather at Christmas dinner, told me my jollof rice was better than anything he'd eaten in 30 years, and threatened to move in with us so he could have it regularly. Christian looked at me with an expression of mild apology. I told Daeho he was welcome any Sunday he wanted. The look Christian gave me after that was a different kind entirely, soft and unguarded but full, and I mentally filed it alongside all the others in the category I had titled Christian. The third thing, the blind date report that Christian was supposed to give his grandfather about the setup came in, technically, very delayed. Daeho said he considered it a successful match, and he was not wrong. And that, from beginning to end, is the story of how I walked into a restaurant to be a disaster and walked out in love with my CEO. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Sometimes the plan falling apart is the plan working perfectly. Sometimes the worst night of your life is just the best one wearing a disguise. And sometimes a blind date, a borrowed name, and an absolutely unreasonable amount of chocolate soufflé is all it takes to meet someone special. That's the end of our story, and I genuinely hope you loved it as much as I loved telling it. If you're smiling right now, drop a heart in the comments. If you cried even a little, I absolutely need to know. And if you want more stories like this one, then subscribe right now because we have so much more coming and you do not want to miss it. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a love story today, and I'll see you in the next one.